but for tonight, I'm going to go through a few different things, just little tidbits of information to kind of build up on what we learned last class. Next week, we'll be doing Shin Kalei, where we'll be gluing things together, but today we'll go through a few different things. I'll start with my list. So first thing I'll go through is transferring. So a different way to transfer. So last week I showed you how to transfer with the newsprint and Conte paper, where you lay it down like carbon paper and then you trace it. Another way to do a transfer is using a photocopy or something that's done on a laser printer. So it has to be toner. So you can't use inkjet. Most people at home probably have inkjets. Where I work on campus, we have a laser printer. We mostly use it for this, but you go to Staples or whatnot and get a photocopy done. The photocopy, it works better if it's fresher. Within a few hours, within a half an hour is really ideal, but within a few hours is fine. I did this afternoon. My woodchuck.
How much wood could a woodchuck?
Yeah.
Could chuck wood?
Yeah, I wanted to show text, so it's there.
Cool.
Yeah. So, need that toner, and if you do get it photocopied, some places use a higher quality paper to get a better photocopy. You don't want that. You want to use the cheapest paper possible. So I think the high quality paper holds on to the toner more to give you that better photocopy, but then the transfers don't work as well, I find. So cheaper the better. For this class, if you do have images that you want to transfer, if you send me email me an image and let me know what size, I can print them out and then bring them to class for Wednesday to do the transfer here.
Cool.
So I'm sure you're already thinking. The nice thing about this is if you have text, for example, it will reverse it for you, so you don't have to try to draw it out mirror image. Or you have something that's very detailed, or lots of straight lines and geometric shapes, then you don't have to try to redraw it again with the Conte paper. So to do the transfer.
So you're saying if we send you something, you will photocopy it for us?
Yeah. If you don't have access to a photocopy at work or
Yeah.
at home or a laser printer, then as long as you do it before Wednesday or Wednesday evening.
Well, even Monday, I'm sure.
Monday or Tuesday, yeah, something like that. Then I can photocopy and just make sure I make a note on my phone, do the printing, and then stick it in my bag. So I'll forget about it. Then I'll realize I did it earlier. Because that's the way things are right now. Anyways, yeah. But yeah, if you want to, just send me an image with the size and then do that. So photocopy. So the stuff that we're going to use to transfer the image is called wintergreen oil, or oil of wintergreen. So it's an essential oil. You can get it at like a health food store. Drugstores sometimes carry it, like pharmacies. Oftentimes you'd have to special order it in.
Nutters, maybe?
Nutters probably has it, yeah. Yeah.
And I think Sobeys actually has a pretty good selection.
Right. Yeah, it's used for, honestly, it's like a massage oil. Use it for backaches and strains and whatnot. I think someone told me it works by, it's actually a kind of a mild poison. So you put it on your skin, and it kind of, because it's a poison, blood rushes to the surface of your skin to get rid of the poison being absorbed through your skin, and that increases circulation, and then you feel less sore. That's what someone told me. I don't know if that's totally accurate.
Just a little bit of poison.
Yeah. So usually if you go into a drugstore and you tell them you want oil of wintergreen, they think you need something for muscle soreness, so they'll point you to something safer. So you take some of that and use a rag or a shop towel. Put a little bit on, and then you want to rub the back of the print for the photocopy. This probably works best with images that have more contrast to them. So text works really great. if you have lots of grays, especially if you go from like a dark gray to a black, sometimes the transfer will just end up looking like a big blob of dark gray. You won't see much of a difference between the dark gray and the black. But
So the more contrast, the better.
yeah, I would say so. So it should look like this. So it's saturated, translucent, you can see your image to the back of the paper. But it shouldn't be soaking wet. If you put too much oil wintergreen on, it'll just smudge the image. It'll just blur it. If you put too little, then nothing will transfer. So that's what you're kind of looking for. Kind of like a greasy takeout bag look. Put up. And this replaces a lot more harsher chemicals, like we used to use lacquer thinner in the studio and acetone, which is pretty nasty. Not very good for you. Then we're going to lay down a piece of newsprint on top. And then just apply pressure to the back, just like you're going to print it. So you can use a spoon or a Baron. This one's called a tadpole. It's a smaller version of that glass Baron sugar. Moved a little bit, but you can see it transferred.
Oh,
Very
really
well.
nice.
Yeah.
Oh, I like that.
If you didn't want your photocopy to move too much, you can tape it down with some masking tape or green painter's tape so it doesn't move so much. Notice a little bit, I moved a little bit, but that's okay.
Is that a photograph?
Yeah, it's a photograph. So you can use a photograph, you can draw something, take a picture of it or scan it, and then photocopy it. I like using it for drawing because I like the marks I make when I draw. I like when they transfer over to the block, you can capture that drawn look. So, and it smells minty, so
Can you eat it?
no,
It's poison.
it's poison.
Oh, oh, oh.
It's also a blood thinner. So,
Oh, yeah.
I don't know. Anyways, wear gloves when you're using it. It is a safer option than to like lacquer thinner or acetone, which is quite bad for you. So I have oil wintergreen here, so you can help yourself and use it. And just let it dry for a few minutes, and then you can carve into it. But it's nice because it reverses for you,
Yeah.
so you don't have to think about reversing text, for example. Or, so it's another way to transfer an image onto your block. So you can use it as you wish. So that's the first thing. Next thing I'll talk about is, well, two things. So with lino, it's really easy to cut out shapes. So you probably noticed some of the blocks I showed you last week are shaped, cut out. So that's an option to think about as you're working. It's pretty straightforward. You just cut out the shape that you want. I would heat the lino. It's a lot easier to cut. Make sure you have a sharp X-Acto knife. So if you use like an iron or a hot plate, or we have a blow dryer here and heat up the lino, it's a lot easier to cut. You just take your time and be patient. But I like cutting out shapes for lino, but it's an option. The opposite end of that is to back your lino. So sometimes, I don't know if you notice, if you carve a lot of your lino out, it tends to warp a little bit, and it can be a little bit harder to print. So what some people like to do is back their lino. So give it a rigid backing, just so it's nice and flat when you ink it up and print it. So you can buy pre-backed lino. For some reason, the stuff that you buy through Speedball, the backing is like this thick, and I'm trying to figure out why it's that thick. It would be really hard to run through a press. It's probably meant to be printed by hand, or maybe used as a stamp. Really all you need is, and this is what we use at the university, is an 1/8 inch thick piece of MDF or hardboard. And then something to attach your lino to. So what I like to use is contact cement. So the contact cement I have here is not your traditional contact cement. It's water soluble, so it's low odor. If anyone's used contact cement in the past, it doesn't quite have a
Yeah,
smell to it,
it
right?
does.
So this one doesn't really smell very much at all. So if you're going to back your lino with contact cement and the MDF, then you want to put some contact cement on one side of the MDF, and then you want to put it on the back of your lino, so the burlap side. I'm just pouring a little bit on because my brush is too big for the bottle that I have. And you could pour it in a container if you want to.
Could you use something like Mod Podge?
Maybe.
Where are you picking up the MDF?
Home Depot.
Home Depot?
I have small pieces here, so
Oh, okay.
the only thing we don't have here is a saw. It'd be nice to have a table saw, so I just score it with an X-Acto knife.
Oh,
It
okay.
works. The edges are a little bit rough, but that's what we have here. So it's water soluble. You can try washing out the brush and trying to get one or two more uses out of it, but eventually I'll just kind of get worn out and just throw it out. But I'll have brushes and contact cement and MDF here for you if you want to try backing your boards, blocks. So it'll look like this. It'll be kind of milky, and as it dries, it goes clear. So I did this before class, so I don't know, maybe 10-15 minutes, depending on how much you put on. The contact cement on the back of your lino is going to take longer, just because the burlap is more absorbent, so it sucks in more of the cement. So when both of them are dry and clear like this, then you can just carefully line up an edge or corner. And then press down. And the two dried surfaces, when they contact, they'll stick to each other. Contact cement. And then you have a backed piece of lino that's more rigid. So if you do find that your lino gets warped, especially if you do a lot of cutting, it might be quite floppy, and then it might be a pain to print and line up and register. When we go into color, backing your lino is a good idea, because registration, lining things up is really important. So that might be more of a thing you want to do for color. For black and white, like I said, it's optional. Up to you. So that's backing, and then cutting out shapes, which you can't really back. You could back it and then use like a scroll saw or something, if you're handy with tools. I've seen students do that before. Or else you just work with this. Go back it. Okay. What's next? Next thing to talk about is registration. So last class, we inked up our blocks, and then we kind of eyeballed the paper, we just put it on top and then print it. If you want to be consistent on where your blocks sit, or your prints sit on your paper, so you have nice even margins all the way around, then you want to make a registration sheet. It's pretty straightforward. I use newsprint. You could use a piece of cougar paper or even draw on Mylar if you want to. So what you want to do is, with a fine pen or a pencil, you want to trace out two sides of your block. So, like that. So that's the block. The right block. Like so. And then you want to put your paper on top. So you have to decide what size of paper you want. And then trim it down to that size. So my block is 6 by 4. It's up to you on what you want to do for margins. I like margins, so I like giving myself at least an inch. Usually in the top and the sides, and then a little more on the bottom is kind of a tradition. You do a little more on the bottom because you'll typically sign, in addition, the print on the bottom, so you want to give yourself a little bit more room. So for example, you do 1 inch on the top and sides, then it might be 1.5 inches on the bottom, just to give you a little more room. Plus there's something called an optic float. I think it's more of a term used in photography. But if you make all your margins even, it looks like the image is slipping. It's a little bit too low.
It seems
doesn't
like
seem centered.
it seems like the bottom margin is wrong.
Yeah.
Like it looks like it doesn't look like an inch. It'll look like 3/4 of an
Yeah,
inch. or
even though
something.
it is an inch. So if you give
Yeah.
yourself a little bit of space, it creates it. It makes it look like the image is centered on the page. So it's an optical illusion, I guess. The optic float. So I said 4 by 6. So I have to do math. So then you want to trim the paper.
Are you trimming you're trimming your final paper?
Yeah.
Okay.
If you're doing proofs on newsprint, you don't really necessarily have to worry about registration,
Mm-hmm.
unless you're really particular. Then go for it. But usually just plop it on top and then print until I'm happy. Or if you're going to print on the Japanese washi paper and you're planning to shinkale it or mount it onto another piece of paper, then you don't really have to worry about registration because you're going to be trimming it down to the image. I'll show you that next week. This is if you're printing on your final piece of paper, you want even margins all the way around.
Mm-hmm.
And it's nice and square to the paper, then I'd recommend doing a registration sheet.
Mm-hmm.
So for trimming your paper, to get it ready for the final printing, you have 2 options. You can use an X-Acto knife and then have straight edges, and that's totally acceptable. If you do use an X-Acto knife, make sure you have a sharp blade, and then make sure you have something underneath that you don't care about cutting into. Here we have these boards that they use for painting, so you can grab a board and cut onto it all you want. Don't cut on the tables. Or you can tear your paper, which is usually what I do. So when you buy a nice sheet of European rag paper, that cotton-based paper, it'll have deckled edges. So this nice kind of rough edge. So when we trim our paper, if we use a knife, we lose that nice edge where we cut it. So we do something called tearing our paper. So ideally, when you tear your paper, you want to tear it from the back. So most papers, if you look at it, has a watermark. So this is Somerset satin. If you look closely, it has a watermark. I don't know if everyone can see that, if I hold it up right here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the name of the paper. So it's embossed on the back, so that's the back of the paper. So ideally, you want to tear from the back. So I've marked, I'm going to tear 6 inches from the end here. So I've marked 6 inches here and here. And then I have a ruler that has a bit of a beveled edge. That's ideal. At the university we have heavy tear bars. So they're wider and they're heavier and they have a nice beveled edge for tearing.
Beveled edge meaning like metal?
Metal. It's metal and it comes to a
Mhm.
point, right? Then line up those 2 marks. And then you want to hold down the ruler or tear bar, and then you want to take the paper and pull it towards the ruler. So that way you could you mimic that deckled edge. Okay, and then I'll do the same for that side.
What's the size for class?
For the suite?
Yeah.
I think we've decided on, I think it's 7.5 by 11. So if you take a full sheet of cotton rag paper and cut it into 8s, that should be 7.5 by 11. It'll be a little bit off because it's not exactly 22 by 30, it's like 22.5 by 30 and like a quarter for some paper. But unless people want to work smaller, but it's usually the size we choose. That's the size I showed you last week. And I can show you again. So it's best if you prepare your paper, whether you cut it with an X-Acto knife or tear it before you start printing to keep everything nice and clean. And then for your registration sheet, you can either measure off the marks you made for your block, or else you can trace your paper. So you kind of, hard to do, but basically figure out where the side margin will go and then mark that, and then figure out where your bottom margin is going to go and mark that. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Or else you can just measure out from an inch from the side and then 1.5 inches from the bottom. My math is right. So now I have my block and I have my paper marked out. So when I print, I have my registration sheet. I've got a clean piece of Mylar. This is kind of clean on top, just to protect the registration sheet. Inevitably, you'll get ink on the back of your block. It's just going to happen as you print. So you'll get ink on the Mylar, but Mylar is easier to clean than trying to clean a piece of newsprint with ink on it. You just wipe it with some cloth and maybe a little bit of soap and water, and you're good to go. So every time you print, you lay down the block on the marks you have for your block, and the same with your paper. For your paper, what I like to do is line up the paper with the bottom edge of the registration sheet, marks, and then drop it. And once you drop it, try not to move it, because you can smudge the ink that's on there. So it'll look kind of like this, which is hard to show on a camera. But basically, your block goes there and then your paper goes there. And that way you get nice straight margins, hopefully. You could get a larger sheet of paper and then just tear it down after, but this way I guess you conserve paper and keep everything consistent. So that's making a registration sheet. And that's tearing paper. As you're printing, if you notice that your fingers are getting dirty, you'll probably have scrap pieces of paper. If you take a scrap piece of paper like this, and make kind of a Z or a lightning bolt, you can make little holders to hold your paper. So if your fingers are really dirty,
Oh, yeah.
Some people use playing cards. They'll just fold playing cards in half. And then,
Yeah.
so if you're worried about keeping your paper clean, this is the way to do it. Any questions so far? I think the last thing I'll show you tonight is sharpening your tools. So what I like to use is this green honing compound. So these are for sharpening wheels. You get this at Lee Valley. So it's it has silicone in it that abrades the metal.
What's that called again?
Honing compound.
Oh, okay.
Honing. Your honing knife or carving tools. One more thing to show you. So what I like to do is grab a scrap piece of wood, and this has been used a lot. And either make a groove or find a groove that matches the size of your tool. So if you're making a groove for your tool, it's probably easier to go with the grain if you're using wood. And you want to make a really deep cut. So these grooves are quite deep. And then you want to take the honing compound and rub some of it into the groove. So now it's green. And then you want to take your tool and you want to hold it like you're going to cut that groove and just go back and forth. So it's going to abrade the metal and sharpen it. So just go back and forth. You'll see inside the groove, it'll go from green to gray. The gray is the metal that's actually being abraded by the silicone. So when you sharpen the outside of the tool, it creates kind of a burr, almost like a curl of metal on the inside. So even after you finish, if you sharpen your tool from the outside and then start carving, your tool might be like really blunt and dull and you're wondering what's going on. So you need to take care of that burr. So I usually either take a piece of dowel or a chopstick and I'll rub some of the silicone onto that and then rub the inside of it. Or else take a piece of sandpaper and just, so 600 grit sandpaper, something fine, and just sand the inside just a little bit just to get rid of that burr. Some people even take the tool and go like this to knock off the burr, whichever works best. I usually use sandpaper, although sometimes I do this because wake you up.
Or knock on wood.
Or knock on
Is
wood.
that what you're saying?
Yeah. And then I usually test the tool. Especially if you're using wood, if you're going against the grain and it cuts really nicely, then you know you got a nice sharp tool. And that works for the V gouge and U gouges. The knife, it's flat, so you almost have to rub some of the silicone on a flat piece of wood or a flat surface and then go back and forth. Honestly, you're probably better getting an X-Acto knife and you can just snap off the edges, the blade as you need to, and keep it nice sharp blade. Lee Valley also makes this thing. I haven't used it that much. A student bought it a few years ago, so I bought one for myself. It's okay. I don't know.
Better to make your own grooves.
That's the way I work that way. This one, it has kind of these raised surfaces, so you can actually sharpen the inside. And then there's a leather strop where you can rub some of the silicone on and then kind of go back and forth. Or actually, don't go back and forth, otherwise you'll be cutting into the leather. But if you go kind of back, in the opposite direction of your cutting, and that'll help sharpen the blade. I haven't used it enough to decide whether or not I like it or not. But I have one here. If you want to try it out, you can. Again, this will be here for you to use. And it's a good idea to keep your tools sharp as you're working, if you're using the honing compound. I find if you're carving nonstop for like 2 weeks, especially if you're using something like wood, and then try to sharpen your tools, it'll take a lot of work with this. In that case, I'll probably use like a sharpening stone, and that'll take longer. So if you kind of keep up with your sharpening as you go along when using this, it'll work a lot better.
Do you sharpen it every day?
Depending on what I'm doing.
What you're
yes.
doing?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm working
Okay.
every couple days. And if you're working mostly with lino, your tools should be fine. But if you're working with wood, like I said, good idea to keep your tools nice and sharp.
It looks like somebody was working on wood and
Yeah.
then didn't.
Maybe. Is that the V gouge?
Yeah.
Yeah. Some of those V gouges in that tool set, they're pretty chipped, and they just come that way. Yeah. Yeah. We had a class today, and they were a number of students were coming up to me with these chipped V gouges. So I went through our old sets and tried to find a better V gouge for them.
Maybe I'll do that.
Yeah, rummage through there. So they're used to it. So. I guess the very last thing I should talk about is signing and editioning your prints. So I gave you a handout. So it's on the same handout which is the cutting patterns. So when you do your print suite or any kind of edition print, you want to make sure you sign and edition them. That's kind of your traditional way to sign and edition your prints. So first thing, you always want to use pencil. Never use pen or marker. Never. Pencil is archival, so it'll last the ages. Pen and marker aren't, and over time it'll fade. Plus, if you use a Sharpie to sign a print, it looks really good, in my opinion. Typically, the title goes in the center, your name goes on the right, and the edition number goes on the left. That can vary. When I was in school, the edition number, we did the edition number in the middle, and then the title, then the name. I don't know why. Someone said it was a European way to sign, but I don't know for sure. As long as the information's there. Some people, instead of using the bottom, they'll sign on the side of the print. Or if your print goes all the way to the edges of the paper, then you can sign the back if you wanted to.
What was the order again?
Pardon me?
What was the order again?
So typically the title goes in the center, so title in the center.
It says it on here.
Yeah, it's on there. Your name goes on the right, and then the edition number on the left. So for edition number, let's go through quickly. The one you use the most is that first one. So for example, have 1/4. So where 1 is the number of that specific print, and 4 is the total number of prints in the edition. So you label them 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, and 4/4. It's up to you on how you want to number them. Some artists are very organized, and they'll number the very first one they do 1, and then the second one they do 2 and 3. I don't know anyone who does that, but it is possible. Some people will put their better for the lower quality prints towards the end. That's not really good practice to do. Hopefully they're all consistent. So what I mean by an edition of prints is they're as close to each other as possible. They're printed by hand, so there are going to be differences, but ideally they're as close to each other as possible. So if you want to do an edition of, let's say 8 for the suite, you might end up starting off with 12 prints and decide which 8 are the best out of that 12, for example. So when you do an edition of prints, they should be printed as best you can and be as close to each other as possible. That's the tradition. So besides the 1 whichever number, there's artist proof or AP. So the artist sets aside a small number, usually about 15% of the final edition, to keep for themselves. So if you happen to see an artist proof for sale, that means it's a print from the artist's own collection, so it might be worth a little bit more if you're thinking about collecting art. It can also mean the print is a one of a kind, so the artist has done something different with that particular print that makes it unique in that edition. So they might change the color of the ink, for example, or do some hand drawing, or multiple colors on one block instead of just a black and white. So they've done something different that makes it unique from the edition. S over P is state proof. So it's a print done while the print is in progress. So if you're working on your blocks and after a while you want to pull a proof and see what it looks like, that would be called a state proof if you want to keep track of things. You could just label it state proof and you go state proof 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Experimental proof and varied edition is kind of similar to that second definition of an artist proof. So it's something that's done to the print that makes it different from the rest of the prints in the edition. And finally, BAT, or pardon my French, bon intérêt. Sure. It literally means best pull. So it's one way to do an edition of a print. So as you're printing, the very first print you do on good paper that's really well done, that's the print, that becomes your BAT. So when you're working in your studio, whether you're printing by hand or on a press, you put that BAT up on a bulletin board, and every time you pull a print, you compare that print to the BAT. If it's comparable, then that becomes part of your edition. If it's different from your BAT or not as good as your BAT, it's set aside in your reject pile, or you can use it for artist proofs or whatnot. So that's what I mean if I say a BAT, a bon intérêt, or if you see one in a gallery. So it's again a more traditional way to do an edition. Let's compare it to a BAT. Make sense? Cool. So I think that's all I have for demos today.